surgery meeting, his killer is serving a whole life term. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 37 points at 79.23. The pound will buy $1.25 and €1.16.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy, part-owner wind farm for a greener way to power your home.
Rain moving in from the southwest overnight, which will also push into southern areas of Scotland, staying mostly dry though in the south and the east of the UK, with an overnight low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
It is 9 on LBC. Welcome to the programme if you've just joined us. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Now, if I had got into Parliament, there are two ministerial jobs that I would have liked to do. And one of them would be to be Secretary of State for Transport, and the other one would have been to be Prisons Minister. And if I'd been appointed Prisons Minister, I'd like to think that I would have said to the Prime Minister, can you not reshuffle me? Can you keep me in this job for the next few years? Because we have had so many prisons ministers. I've lost count, actually. Since 2010, I think there must have been probably around 14 or 15 of them. And several of them actually had some really good ideas about reforming prisons. But of course, then they're reshuffled somewhere else. A new minister comes in. By the time they've got their feet under the table, they're reshuffled to somebody else. And so it goes on. It's a continuous cycle. And if I have any bit of advice for Keir Starmer, if he wins the election, is to appoint someone as prisons minister who really understands the subject and has ideas about how to reform the prisons. And to make sure that whoever is appointed Secretary of State for Justice, because prisons come under the Justice Department, that they have a real interest in this as well, because otherwise nothing will change. We have a prison population now of just under 90,000. There are new prisons being built, but we know that the prison estate is almost full, and therefore judges are being asked to reduce sentences or not give as long sentences as they might have done otherwise, which is fine if you're somebody who hasn't committed an offence, which means that you're a danger to society, but it's not fine for people convicted of really serious crimes. So there's all sorts of things that need to be changed, not least in the prison education system. It is a scandal that virtually all the people who go into prison not being able to read or write come out of prison not being able to read or write. Well, is it any wonder, therefore, that our recidivism rates, the people who come out of prison and then recommit offences, are far too high, far higher than many other countries in Europe? So there's all sorts of different aspects to prison reform that we can talk about in this hour. And that's what we're going to do, because we have Ian Acheson with us. He is the author of a new book called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. He's a former prison governor as well. Ian, welcome.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything that I've said in that introduction that you would take issue with, but I mean, there are lots of other issues that we can talk about in relation to prison and why the prison estate is as it is. But what drove you to write the book?
Well, let me try to answer that with numbers. So in 2010, we had 85,000 people in prison and about 25,000 prison officers to look after them. In 2016, we had round about the same number of prison population, about 85,000, and we had only 18,000 prison officers to look after them after an act of what I would call ideological vandalism and criminal stupidity in terms of the austerity impact on the justice system, removed all those officers very quickly and effectively because of the way the exit packages were constructed. Expensive officers with lots of experience were removed from the system. Now, anybody in 2010 could have and should have, which is why I don't absolve Whitehall as well as Westminster from this catastrophe, known that doing so many cuts so deep and so quickly would result in a catastrophe. And every metric of decency, of self-harm, of assaults went into the skip. And in 2016, there was a riot in a place called Earlstoke. Now, I left the prison service in 2001. And for a year, they left me accidentally in charge of Earlstoke, which you probably never have heard of. If you go on the main line from Exeter to London and you pass the White Horse on the hillside, there is actually a prison buried in Wiltshire's countryside, which is a small Category C prison. And when I was in charge of it and running it, it was a really good place to be. So the staff-prisoner relationships were excellent. It was a place where security was preserved, but decent relationships were built. It had an interesting population, including lifers, but it was a stable staffing corps. Morale was high, and we were doing our job, and it was actually quite an enjoyable place to be. So it would have been a really, really hard place to plunge into the disorder in 2016 that then revealed itself. So I thought about writing a book. I was so dismayed and perplexed by what was happening. I thought, well, surely we need to make a fuss here about what's happening to the criminal justice system and what might be able to fix it. So the book has been quite a long time in gestation, I suppose. And I've left it to do other things, including, as you've said, a review of extremism for Michael Gove. But I've been involved in the prison business. And unfortunately, the chapters keep writing themselves. So if we go now to today, the prison estate is about 97% full, which has caused all the furore over emergency release of prisoners further and further into their sentences, now up to 60 days potentially, and violent offenders being released because there simply isn't a way of getting ahead of the rising prison population by the building programme. And we still have about 10% fewer staff than when we had 4,000 fewer prisoners in the population in 2010. And actually, if you look at the prison staff who have been recruited, Liz Truss, to give her due, back in 2016 recognised this was an emergency and started the emergency recruitment. But the calibre of prison staff who have now been recruited and are very hastily and badly trained and thrown into the maw of a system which is overrun by drugs, where the workshops stand empty and so on, is so different from the experience that's been removed that looking at the rates of attrition, they're leaving almost as fast as they can be recruited. And the reason I called the book Screwed was kind of twofold. First of all, it's a play on the pejorative term that prison officers were known as screws. But also it's to say, finally, that the engine of rehabilitation in prisons are prison staff, frontline prison staff, not the bureaucrats that are squatting over the top of this system, the 5,000 odd people who sit in prison service headquarters doing God knows what. They are the men and the women who pull on a uniform and do an extraordinarily complex job that I was, if I'm still asked, and I've been around the park and I've done a few things, if somebody said to me, what's the job you're most proud of in your life? I would absolutely and immediately say being a frontline prison officer. So that book is dedicated to those people. It's an angry book, but I hope it's quite hopeful in terms of the things it's saying need to be done and can be done to fix it.
And what's the difference between being a prison officer in 2024 and, say, 2001?
Well, I think the training, first of all, the quality of the training has been slashed. We used to have training colleges, national training colleges for prison staff. At least one of them was closed. And now we have training hastily taking place far fewer weeks in duration residentially before young people who have not been very well vetted. And we know that from, for example, the scandal over the Sunday Times investigation, where an undercover reporter was able to just walk into a job as a uniformed operational support grade. So I think we're talking about the experience, the life experience of the people who are coming in. And we're talking about how they are trained and selected. But I guess also we're talking about a prison population that is more prone now to oppositional behaviour, so the legitimacy is breaking down, drugs have a lot to do with that, and where extreme violence is a fact of life. We've literally got statistics to date that say that every hour of every day a prison officer is assaulted, 365 days a year.
And that was different 25 years ago?
Yes, the assault rates were dramatically different. I still remember, I left in 2001, as you said, and I left from Dartmoor Prison, which was a very hard prison to run. It was the end of the line for many prisoners who misbehaved. And back then, if a prison officer was assaulted, it would have been sort of news for weeks. And one of the things I consistently say when people accuse me of being a bit hawkish about all of this, when I talk about order and control, is that I remember being head of security in Wandsworth Prison when the Pimlico Opera Company were coming in. I remember being a duty governor at Dartmoor Prison when we filmed an overnight escape for a film called Breaking Out or something. It was a film that had Timothy Spall and James Nesbitt in it. Can you imagine what the Daily Mail would do to that these days? They were filmed going over the wall of an operational prison at night time. The reason we were able to do those things, to take risks and to make prison a more hopeful experience, more positive experience, was because we were totally in charge of the environment. And that is simply not the case now.
Why?
Drugs, inexperienced staff. I mean, if you look at Charlie Taylor's, the Chief Inspector of Prisons reports, Charlie turned around a school as a primary school teacher, which was failing by insisting on behaviour, so he knows what he's talking about. Almost every report that he does, and most of them are dire, some aren't, but most are, he will lament the fact that prison staff do not enforce low-level rules and civility. We have to have foundationally in prisons pro-social behaviour and a pro-social environment and consequences for poor behaviour. And I'm afraid
it's just
we don't
like
have enough
schools,
staff
isn't it?
and they're not experienced enough to do that.
If you don't have a head teacher in a school who isn't enforcing discipline, well, guess what happens? The school fails. It's presumably exactly the same concept in prisons.
It is. I used to say being a prison governor was like being the mayor of a town nobody wanted to live in. And that included some of the staff. But, those dynamics are incredibly important, which is why I wrote recently, for example, about an inspection that the Chief Inspector did to Whitemoor Prison, which holds a huge amount of our national security risk and bangs up, dozens and dozens of terrorists. And he said it was the most filthy prison that he'd ever inspected. I have a very straightforward view of these things, and it's the broken window theory, if you like. And I'm thinking, if a high security prison, our most sort of surveilled piece of real estate in the country, cannot get the bins emptied, what else is going wrong in that place? Because I am damn sure it does not stop there. So there are all sorts of things that are feeding into this kind of toxic mix of failure. Some of it can be fixed by money. Money was taken out, resources were taken out. Lots of governors are given, frankly, completely impossible jobs to do if they're expected to rehabilitate prisons. Some of it is cultural. Some of it is about the leadership of the prison service. They evade accountability. They're invisible people. They never appear on TV like chief constables might to explain some of these rolling catastrophes that are happening. They are unaccountable. They feel remote. I think many of them have been in place too long. We've got a C-suite in prison service headquarters where you've got chief operating officers, directors general, executive directors sort of falling over each other. And on the front line, you cannot sometimes have enough staff to run, to even get prisoners served their meals.
So it's just like the MOD, basically. You've got sort of 60,000 civil servants in Whitehall and an army that's barely bigger than that.
Yes. Well,
so it's top heavy with bureaucrats.
Yeah.
That's what you're basically saying.
Yeah, and I speak as I describe myself as a recovered bureaucrat. I was a senior civil servant in the Home Office. And then I led this independent inquiry into the prison service's capacity to deal with extremism, which I think was extremely embarrassing to them, because it was the first time somebody who understood that culture was starting to ask questions on behalf of a politician. And I give great credit to Michael Gove for having the foresight to equip me to be able to go in and do that. I think now that sort of inquiry would be resisted because, frankly, somebody like Alex Chalk would not want to know what the answers were.
Why?
Because they would be so awful. Because, every metric of performance is going in the wrong direction. Because, you ask me why. Because why does it take, and I'm sure this must exercise the Lord Chancellor, why does it take the accident of a random independent inspection to go into places like Bristol, like Exeter, like Cookham Wood, the child prison, like Wetherby, to reveal just how bad things are when there is a gigantic bureaucratic structure allegedly of supervision going on with prison group directors, for example, sort of super governors, and quite a large staff in charge of doing just that. You know, when people say to me, you're being unfair and you're criticising people who can't answer back and it's all to do with resources, I point back to Bedford Prison. Rioting in 2016, what's that, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. In special measures since then, endless pilot schemes, endless coaching, endless support that sort of came in and dried up. Then it had an urgent notification, which is basically Charlie Taylor's red flag to ministers back in 2022, I think. And then it's had another red flag notification where it's describing a place where the segregation unit, when it rains, it gets inundated with raw sewage. And people are walking through it, where it describes an environment that is awash with filth and squalor, where now we have revealed through the Sunday Times undercover investigation, there were people being employed with virtually no training, with no vetting, to be in close proximity of prisoners who were walking in off the street right into the centre of the prison. They could have had explosives or arms or anything with them. So that's not about resources.
Just on that, I remember I don't know whether this was the last time we talked about prison reform, but there'd been an escape, and a caller phoned in who had actually worked at that particular prison, and he said he had worked on the gates, on security. And I said to him, "So what training did you have for that?" And he said, "Absolutely none."
Yeah.
And I mean, I actually think the escape record in this country is not actually. I mean, there was a huge outcry about this guy that escaped. But when I looked at the figures about how many escapes there had been in this country since 2017, I can't remember what it was, but it was a much lower figure than I ever imagined it would be.
Yes, and to be fair, the prison service has a good record in that. And, you know, it should be, given all the millions that are invested in physical and human security, especially in our high security prisons. There hasn't been an escape, I think, since the Whitemoor escape of the IRA prisoners and the London gangster back in the mid-90s. But, you know, that is one metric that, you know, the service should be proud of. But actually, it shouldn't be allowed to conceal other things. And I think one of the things that's happening is that you're not having mass disorder in prisons because there is a sort of Faustian pact, if you like, that says we will permit an acceptable level of drug dealing. Because actually, I believe, and others like me, including John Podmore, who I know you know, former governor of Swaleside and Brixton, a much more senior person than me. But, you know, we both think there's a kind of impasse here where there is a sort of appeasement of a certain amount of dealing going on. Because actually, the drugs economy, which is driven by organised crime in prisons, is almost too big to be allowed to fail. If you go in and you try to take the drugs out, so in other words, if you cut off the supply without doing anything for demand, you're going to have reaction now because it is so lucrative. There's such a massive markup, a literally captive audience with all the mental health markers and behavioural markers to consume the drugs.
Right.
But it won't be allowed to fail without quite widespread disorder.
Well, we spent 21 minutes talking about a lot of negative things. Before we get to the news at past, I want to talk about some positive things that can be done to make things better. And then we'll go to calls from listeners. If you'd like to have a word with Ian, the number 0345 6060 973. It's 22 minutes past 9 on LBC.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Ian Dale. Tweet at LBC.
24 minutes past 9. Ian Acheson is with us. He's the author of a book called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. We're going to come to your calls in a few minutes' time, but before we do, I want to talk about some of the solutions, because it's so easy, isn't it, to diagnose what all the problems are, because we can see a lot of the problems. It's less easy to come up with realistic solutions that don't cost a lot of money, because we all know that whoever's in government over the next few years, nobody's going to double the prison budget, are they? So what can be done in the short term to make things better?
Well, I think all decisions that need to be made are fairly radical, short term or long term. One of the things that has to be done is to get the prison service to focus on one thing only, on foundational security and safety in prisons. So in other words, make the environment safe for its workforce. And that encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses certainly the training doctrine. I think there needs to be a fundamental review of the training doctrine, the selection. We need to change the supervision model. There used to be a very straightforward model in prisons when they didn't have uniforms, incidentally, that looked like they were slightly worse than a discount airline, not a uniform to be proud of in any respect. And part of that reason, by the way, is because you've got a bizarre split between the boss class in suits and the operational front line in uniforms, unlike any other law enforcement agency probably in Europe. But you have that kind of split. But back in 2010, 2011, something like that, senior officers who were the frontline supervisors were replaced by something called supervisory officers. And this was an efficiency savings gesture, which meant that senior officers lost their line management responsibility for a group of staff in a geographic place, and they became sort of Sherpas who would follow the work and supervise different groups of prisoners. It's a crazy way. It's a small thing, but it's a crazy way to lead, inspire, motivate, and coach frontline prison staff. So things like that need to happen. And there are lots of small things about the vetting, recruiting, selection, training, and pay of staff. I would also, if I was in the hot seat, no chance of that, but I would look at putting out a national appeal for prison staff who were lost through the austerity cuts, who are still, capable and in age to come back, to be able to come back. And I would recreate Rory Stewart's 10 Prisons project, where he selected 10 of the most disordered prisons, and he put special measures in there to try to figure out what worked to bring violence down. Because violence is totally corrosive. Violence associated with the drug culture, violence against prison staff that is driving them out of the organisation. If you look at staff sickness rates, Ian, they're absolutely eye-watering. Doing something about that is an imperative. In the youth custody estate that only deals with a few hundred now, very challenging juvenile offenders. The youth custody officers that work with them, their annual sickness rate per person is 18 days. Now, if I was talking to Rachel Reeves, I would say you need to focus fundamentally on prison officer safety for the reasons that I've said. The majority of sickness, or the biggest proportion of sickness, is something called mental and behavioural problems. In other words, stress. So staff are overwhelmed by operating in a place where they have to be hyper-vigilant, where they're scared for their safety, and where many of them do not perceive they are well led or well protected by their senior management. So those things need to change. Long term, fundamentally, I'm afraid the physics doesn't work. We are putting far too many people into custody for the good we do them, and we have increasingly less space. We cannot build our way out of the problem. The new prisons project, the new mega prisons that are being built, were supposed to replace the Victorian dungeons where we've had so many problems in London and elsewhere. They're actually now just being added to it, and they can't even keep up. So we've got to come to a decision here about, for example, clearing prisons of non-violent acquisitive drug addicts who are in prison because of a medical condition, because of a physiological and psychological addiction to illicit drugs, and that's driving their offending. They constitute a huge proportion of the 5 6 billion a year we're spending on imprisonment because they are the ones imprisoned for less than 12 months because they're torturing communities that come out again and round because they are shoplifting, for example, prolific shoplifters, to be able to literally go next door to the pub after they've walked out of a corner shop that will probably close in a poor and deprived community, making it poorer still, to put some junk in their arm. So we need to find, in my opinion, something like secure NHS forensic treatment programs for them and create some space and some headroom. I was talking to an ex-prisoner, David Shipley, this morning, and he was saying that because of his experience, he went to prison for fraud, and he went to Wandsworth, where he concurs with some of the stories that are coming out about how awful the place was. But then he went to a Category D prison, an open prison in East Anglia. And he believes, and I think he's right, that we need to dramatically expand open prisons. So you get people who are low risk, who still need to have some form of supervision, and for whom breaking the rules would mean a return to closed conditions, which is a really powerful way of getting compliance out of people. But it also allows people to maintain jobs, for example. And David was telling me this morning, again, and this is a kind of hopeful sign, if you like, about people that he knew who were coming back into prison, people concerned in the drugs trade who were in an open prison, after a day's work, and actually saying to him, showing their pay slip, can the government take this money off me? Because they had no conception of what work is. Just to finish the point on work as well. I mean, we've got, again, a huge bureaucracy inside the prison service that cannot get our workshops to work, that cannot get our education facilities in prisons dealing with anything like the number of prisons that, as you say, need to be able to read and write. But we've got really small and brilliant charities, NGOs, very agile and ambitious ones like Tempus Novo, which was started by two former senior officers at Leeds Prison, and is now, has an enormous track record of selecting people who are leaving custody, getting them into work and keeping them in work, because we don't still know an awful lot about what stops reoffending apart from sustained work.
Before we come to the cause, I do want to have a brief discussion about rehabilitation, because it seems to me that's the forgotten element of this in many of the discussions. But first, let's get the news headlines on LBC at 9:31 with Tim Daly.
O.J. Simpson, the former American football star, controversially cleared of murder, has died of cancer aged 76. His ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside her home in Los Angeles in 1994. Israel says it will retaliate with force if Iran attacks it. There are concerns Tehran is planning a revenge strike after its consulate in Damascus was bombed last Monday. And a report being published in Scotland is warning young transgender people there have reported the lowest level of happiness in a decade. The findings of LGBT Youth Scotland say they're facing unacceptable levels of intolerance. LBC weather, rain moving in from the southwest overnight, which will also push into the south of Scotland. Staying dry though, mostly in the south and the east of the UK, with an overnight low of 8 degrees.
LBC This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
9:35 on LBC. Ian Acheson is with us. He's the author of the new book, Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. Just before we go to the calls, a quick word on rehabilitation. It's something that everyone thinks, well, it's a good idea to rehabilitate prisoners, but not enough resources are devoted to it. How could the system be changed to make it more effective?
Oh, that's a big question. A simple way of answering it is make sure that training and employment and offending behaviour programmes work inside prisons, and they're not some sort of occasional luxury as they are at the moment, and that ties into the staffing, recruitment and retention crisis. But if you get training and employment readiness, work readiness going, you are likely to have prisoners who are leaving custody who are more likely to be employable. But what I would say is if you are employing people to do work, they should be rewarded fairly. First of all, prisoners who do work in prisons, even quite sophisticated work now in some of the industrial prisons that we have, are paid a pittance. I would say pay them at least the minimum wage, give them a productivity bonus if they are properly engaged in delivering the work, but also have a compulsory savings scheme. So they are required to save for release, for example, so that they're required to pay a contribution towards their bed and board. So they're paying a victim surcharge, for example, if that is if there's a victim involved. And what you're doing there is you're making them behave like the rest of us. And that's what prison ought to be to the extent it is possible. And that is to replicate what life is like in the outside world. Because if you just have alienated people who've been, incidentally, more and more addicted to drugs while inside prison, released from custody with 45, 50 quid in their pocket and a tent, because there's nowhere for them to live and they've got no money. It is a recipe for what we have here, 55% reoffending rate for male adults who are serving a sentence of 12 months or less.
Right. James in Nottingham, I think, has got a question related to this. James, hi, go ahead.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
Good, thank you. What would you like to say?
And I'd obviously sort of like you to input this question as well, if that's okay. So I'll be quick because I appreciate other callers. So prisons, as well as being places of detention, are also meant to be places of rehabilitation. And obviously education and work history and reducing drug abuse is part of it. Now, what we don't hear about is the work focusing on offending behaviour programmes. And alongside prison officers were a specialist group of people called forensic psychologists who worked on offending behaviour. They're a bit like clinical psychologists in the NHS. Now, there are not many of these currently, and in my opinion, nor were there ever enough. So my question is, was the prison service ever interested in rehabilitation in relation to offending behaviour?
Hi, James. Very good question. I know quite a few forensic psychologists. They're really good, and I think, yes, there are too few of them. We also have problems with our offending behaviour programmes. We had a sex offender treatment programme that ran for years until an insider leaked information that said that research was showing it was actually making some people worse. So, I would get away from frankly, if you ask me in terms of rehabilitation, get away from some of the more specialist offending behaviour programmes, which have got very little evidence that they work successfully. And I'm talking also about the programmes that are in use, the rather crude programmes to deal with extremist offenders as well, who I know are a very small but potentially lethal part of the population. And I would focus more on workplace employability as a means of rehabilitation. We've got to get workshops back working again. We've got to get training working again. We do have to have offending behaviour programmes, particularly for impulsive and violent young men who are filling our prisons because of acts of extreme and spontaneous violence sometimes. We've got to get a grip on that. We've got a quite serious problem with sexual offending, and in particular people who are part of the sex offender population who are convicted because they are found in possession of child abuse pornography. I'm not talking about all or nothing, but what I would say is for many prisoners, just the opportunity, it's a unique opportunity. We know where they are, and they should have access to services to be able to look at literacy and basic literacy and numeracy problems. I want to see what I've called in the book enterprise prisons, that repurpose people who work very effectively in the black economy to do something in the legitimate economy, to be able to use some of that energy that they have. And I'm not naive. If you're making an enormous amount of money in a high return, low risk occupation like drug dealing, you're not likely to turn into the next Alan Sugar. But there are lots of other people who have never been actually given the opportunity or the skills or the tools or the encouragement to work in the legitimate economy. So that's where I would focus, accepting that we still do need specialists to deal with particularly difficult populations in the prison.
James, quick comeback.
Yeah, I agree about the importance of obviously work and education. However, I think what the agency is forgetting is the fact that offender behaviour can be very complex and can be down to issues relating to sort of, past abuse or other sort of issues. And I think just to say that work and education is going to sort of deal with it, clearly, as is shown in the NHS in relation to how it deals with sort of mental health, that's not the only answer.
OK, James, thank you. Let's go to John, who's a new caller in Trowbridge. John, good evening. What would you like to say?
Good evening to you both. I have actually got some experience with Earlstoke. I go into Earlstoke and have done over the last few years to help run AA meetings in there, out in the abstinence wing in that particular prison. And what's always sort of struck me as odd is that I've actually met people who have left Earlstoke actually and ended up in meetings around the local area as well. So, kind of the AA, and I know NA go in there as well. And that does seem to work for certain people within the prison system. But what's always struck me as slightly odd is that there's almost no secondary once they leave prison, as you've rightly pointed out, because you're essentially giving people pretty much no money when they leave the prison system. They then go back to their old places and old habits. And the fact is there's going to be a high chance of them re-offending and doing exactly the same thing all over again. And it's just like a hamster wheel. And if we're not going to give these guys the tools to actually change their lives properly, then we can't be surprised when it all goes wrong. It just seems a very odd situation to me, to be honest with you.
Hi, John, and thanks for your question. I think what we're talking about here is what should be the role of the probation service. The probation service is part of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, as the name says. It's always been, in my opinion, the Cinderella service in relation to prisons. It was a shotgun marriage, started in I think the early 2000s, a sort of Blairite construction, and the National Offender Management Service that brought the two parts of the criminal justice system together. I happen to think that probation is organisationally and philosophically completely different to the prison service, which should be a law enforcement agency. I like the idea, for example, in Scotland, where they have criminal justice social work. And I think separation ought to be the kind of the destination here, because you have a service at the moment that is completely overwhelmed, and it makes lethal mistakes, unfortunately. And you have a crisis of morale in the probation service. Sky high rates of sickness through stress, for example, in certain places like London. And where you have such a devalued and demoralised workforce that is supposed to be driving all the things that you were talking about, and helping somebody find, leaving prison, somewhere to live and something to do, and continuing any therapeutic intervention that's happened in prisons, although that is fairly scant as it is. But you have people who are not experienced enough or overwhelmed. You're going to have mistakes. And that's what I fear, actually, is going to happen with the executive emergency release that's taking place at the minute. I mean, I understand the necessity to do that, to take prisoners serving less than 4 years out earlier in their sentence than their final release date in order to release some of the pressure. But I do not believe the probation service has the capability or the capacity at the minute to meet that need, because it can't manage its own steady state business. And we have shamefully vandalised the probation service, and we need to, in my opinion, completely separate it from prisons. When I worked at Earlstoke, which I'm glad to say and I know is in recovery, since the situation I described in 2016, there was a chief probation officer. And, to put it crudely, he wanted to let everybody out and I wanted to keep everybody in. And somewhere in that creative tension, risk was managed very well, because we had we had a sort of a general objective to rehabilitate people, but to do so, and minimise the risk. And that sort of creative tension doesn't exist anymore. Risk-taking does not exist anymore. And the sorts of things we were able to do with prisoners in prisons like Earlstoke, which had an amazing, I don't know if it's still there, farms and gardens. Dartmoor had a farm. The alternatives that we could offer prisoners to inspire them and to motivate them simply don't exist anymore, because we're in a sort of algorithmic, risk-averse, managerialist world, and we have the worst of all possible outcomes.
John, thank you very much for your call. More of your calls in just a second to Ian Acheson, the author of the book Screwed. Several people said they've already ordered a copy.
Excellent.
As a result of listening to you. So it's been worth your while coming in tonight.
I do appreciate it.
It's 9:45.
LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 9:48 here on LBC. We're talking to the author of Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It by Ian Acheson. And let's go to some more calls before we wrap up at 10. Matt's in Greenwich. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Ian, and hello, Ian.
Hi, Matt.
Ian, you and I used to work together at Wandsworth when you were head of security, and Matt's not my real name, obviously.
Okay.
And I was head of regimes, and that was about 1997, 98, 99.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I've seen the things about Wandsworth today criticised on Channel 4, it was not the place that we left. When we left, people worked. People went to education. There were programs, reoffending programs. There was, as you said, there was the sexual offending program. All of that went on. And you know what? I just listen every day and I hear how low the prison service has become. Not because of the people that are in it necessarily, but because of the way that it's funded. Because it's not being funded properly. It is a shadow of what you and I enjoyed in those late years in the 1990s.
Well, hi. I think I recognise your voice, but I understand your reasons for.
Thank you.
And you were a very, very valuable colleague because we had a camaraderie there. We were running at that stage, I think, Europe's largest prison. And it was a tough old place, but we were completely in charge. And the thing that you will know and that I know is that when you ask prisoners who they want to be in charge, they will overwhelmingly say, we want the staff to be in charge. And I'm afraid to say, for the reasons that you've described, and some of it is resources, but I think some of it is culture and leadership from the top, as I've said, there are places where it's not clear if the state is actually in charge. And that must be terrifying for people that get locked in a cell with a door with no handle on the inside every night. In fact, I know it is because they speak to me.
I agree. I completely agree. And I remember when there was, issues at Wandsworth when the chief inspector came and badly criticised us, and I think unfairly as well, because one or two inspectors found this or that wrong. It just seemed to me that it was all top down and that people weren't really looking at the good work that was being done, because a lot of good work was being done. And it's a real shame that it's still not being carried on now.
No, I agree with you, and you will remember, as I do, for example, I remember being a principal officer, which was at that stage the highest, just for Ian in the audience, the highest ranking uniformed rank in the prison, running a very busy wing of trials and remands in the mid-90s. And the vast majority of my staff, and this was in Durham Prison, so it was a fairly tough place, were either ex-miners who'd been made redundant or ex-squaddies who'd come out. And, they were a tough old bunch to lead and to manage. But one of the things they have that I, just see disappearing down the drain now is, I suppose you'd call it emotional intelligence. They had life skills and life experience. And these were ex-service men and women, by the way. And they were able to read people in situations well. And, I'm not denying that there were problems with corruption and racism and so on back in my day. And I spent quite a lot of time in Wandsworth. And you'll probably know the people I'm talking about trying to get rid of racists.
I do, yes, I do.
And it was very difficult at the time. But, generally speaking, we were completely in charge of the environment. And as I was saying to Ian earlier, that then became a place where we could take risks. And we could have the Pimlico Opera Company, as I've said, in front of an audience of hundreds, every night, because we were the biggest gang in the prison. We were in charge, and prisoners, by and large, appreciated that. And there was a sense of legitimacy that I think is very fragile at the minute, and that's that contract between prisoners and prison officers.
And if you were still a prison governor, and I said to you after this programme, I'd like to come and present my show from your prison one day, what would your automatic response be to that? Oh my God, not on your life.
Well, back in the day, it would certainly be something that wasn't dismissed out of hand. I mean, and Matt will know as well that some of the great characters that we had, the governing governors at the time, were not sort of people buried in bureaucracy as they are now and doing impossible jobs. They were quite charismatic, idiosyncratic people who would take risks and were actually much more in charge of their environment and their destiny than they are now, where they are so risk averse and so on. So I think, back in the day, we now have prison radio, to be fair. We would have said, well, let's see if we can do it, rather than, what on earth would the Daily Mail say?
We have been trying to do this, and the Ministry of Justice were very pro when we put the request in.
Right.
But they seem to be ghosting us now. So I don't know where that's going to go. But I think it would be fascinating. I mean, obviously, there are difficulties. I mean, sort of, could we actually talk to prisoners on air, that sort of thing? I don't know, but I just think it would be a fascinating thing to do. So we're not giving up on that one yet. Matt, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to James in Gillingham. James, hi.
Hello, Ian. How's the blood sugars today?
I'll measure them now if you really want to know. But what's your question?
Well, I'm really fascinated by what Ian Acheson has to say, because I do prison legal visits. And I've been at one of the prisons in the Sheppey cluster today, the higher grade one, if you know that prison.
Swaleside.
Yes, Swaleside. I get treated very well there by the staff. But if you look at the establishment figures, there's clearly a disproportionate number, but the ratio between prison officer to inmates. Don't go there.
Yeah.
Because the establishment figures are so low that they have to bring in prison officers from other prisons just to bulk up the establishment levels, and those prison officers have to be put up in hotels and stuff like that. And of course, one of the issues we have in Kent is that because of the issues on the channel, the border agency are picking up those applicants who would normally apply to the prison service, whether they're not as prison officers or operational support grades. The other issue is, I'm not going to talk about who I was visiting today because that would be unprofessional, but my client should be in a secure psychiatric unit.
Right.
But there's not enough beds. So the prisons are having to deal with those issues as well, with prisoners who have got severe mental illness. And I mean, I could say today that my visit to my client was an improvement on the last visit where he threatened to punch my lights out. Only this time he spat at me. And I know, so I couldn't think that might be an improvement. But really, mental health, prisons are not there to pick up people who are clearly mentally ill. Secure psychiatric units should be doing that, but there's not enough beds. And I've got every sympathy for the staff at Swaleside. They're doing a wonderful job, yet there's not enough of them. And we need to be looking at that. And you and I know, since 2010, the prison's budget has been salami sliced. And of course, it's going to have a knock-on effect.
OK, let's get to Ian's reaction.
Yeah, I mean, just on your last point, I mean, I've been quite clear, and I make no bones about the fact I'm a member of the Conservative Party, and I regard what has happened since 2010 as an act of criminal stupidity in the austerity cuts to the criminal justice system that was made in Westminster by the coalition government, but then was executed by Whitehall, by senior civil servants who ought to have said, I'm going to need to be instructed to do this, Minister, because it's a resigning matter, because I know what's going to happen. In fact, what did happen. But, you know, just on your mental health point, absolutely right. That, you know, on top of all the other problems, we've got people severely sick and ill prisoners who are in completely the wrong place, who are stuck in a limbo, who can't get out, who can't get into secure forensic beds. And you have prison staff and Swaleside. I absolutely agree with you. I take my hat off to the men and women that go into a place as, you know, as disordered as Swaleside and as full of risk and do a job every day. And there are far too few of them. And they are being poached, of course, by Border Force, by police, all fishing from the same pool. And, you know, that bedevils prisons because we're in a still relatively buoyant economy. And there, you know, you can join as a prison custody officer in HMP Fivewells, one of these new mega prisons. You could go down the road to Lidl, and you could earn almost as much for stacking shelves. And while we have an outrageous system of poor rewards, poor training, poor selection, poor supervision, we are screwed.
Which is a brilliant way of ending the interview because he's just plugged the title of his book, Screwed, by Ian Acheson. That's Acheson if you want to search for it. Britain's Prisons Crisis and How to Escape It. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you over the last hour. Lots of really positive comments coming in on the texts and tweets. Thanks for all of your calls and messages this evening and throughout this week. Now, next week, I'll be back on Monday from 7. I have an exclusive interview with the former Prime Minister Liz Truss. She has her book out next week. Believe me, you'll want to listen to that. And I'll be joined on the panels for Cross Question by the former Conservative Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan. He's been in the news recently, hasn't he? By the SDLP MP Claire Hanna and by Labour's Stella Creasy. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up via Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Coming up at 1 on LBC, it's Clive Ball. But right now, here's Ben Kentish.
Thanks, Ian. Hello. Good evening. Coming up.
When I look at some of the things that are being done in the name of conservatism, I think they're absolutely nuts.
Boris Johnson today becomes the latest senior Tory to suggest that Rishi Sunak's Conservative government just isn't sufficiently, conservative. Do you think that's right? Is it really the case that people aren't voting Tory because they're just not right-wing enough anymore? Or is it that actually they've lurched too far to the right, in your view, that they've become almost the nasty party once again? There's another explanation, isn't there, that this isn't really about policies or ideology at all, that this is just so much about incompetence, about dishonesty, about sleaze. However they market themselves, whatever they promise to do, is the reality just that people are sick of the Tory party?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 10 o'clock. O.J. Simpson, the former American football star, controversially cleared of double murder during the 1990s, has died of cancer at the age of 76. He was acquitted in one of the most widely reported trials of all time before being found liable for the deaths of his ex-wife